If you stay silent long enough in the aftermath of a breakup, something begins to speak louder than words ever did. Truth. And the truth is rarely what they say out loud. It is what their behavior quietly confesses when the mask of attachment falls off. If you think they want friendship because they value your soul connection, pause right there. Because real love does not retreat into confusion after clarity. Real love does not fracture into, let's stay in each other's lives, when commitment has already collapsed. What you are witnessing is not emotional elevation. It is emotional avoidance, dressed in gentleness. Avoidants ask to stay friends not because they are ready for deeper connection, but because they are not ready to sit with loss. Silence feels like punishment to them, not reflection. So they create a softer version of distance, one where they can still feel your presence, without facing the consequences of their absence. It is not intimacy they are protecting. It is discomfort they are escaping. But here is the divine principle hidden inside this pattern. Anything that avoids truth will eventually repeat pain. Life does not allow emotional shortcuts without cost. When someone refuses to fully feel the ending, they prolong it in disguised forms. Friendship becomes the disguise. Familiarity becomes the substitute. And your emotional availability becomes the currency they rely on without commitment. And this is where your awareness must rise. Because not every invitation to stay connected is a bridge to healing. Some invitations are simply bridges back into confusion. And confusion is never love. It is attachment without direction. There is a deeper psychology here. Avoidants often regulate their internal world by controlling external distance. Too close feels suffocating. Too far feels like abandonment. So let's be friends becomes the perfect middle ground. It gives them air without absence, access without responsibility, and emotional relief without emotional depth. But notice what is missing in all of this. Mutual presence, mutual growth, mutual accountability, and if you stay inside that space too long, you begin to confuse proximity with progress. You start believing that being in contact means being in connection. But divine clarity teaches something sharper. Proximity without purpose is emotional noise. It keeps the heart occupied while starving it of real resolution. The truth that most people miss is this. When someone truly values a bond, they do not downgrade it after recognizing its depth. They either step into it fully or step away with respect. What they do not do is place it in emotional limbo and call it peace. That limbo is not peace. It is avoidance with better language. So when an avoidant asks to stay friends, what is often being offered is not a new relationship structure. It is a continuation of emotional comfort without the weight of commitment. It allows them to keep the door slightly open while convincing themselves they have closed it. But closure that still feeds attachment is not closure at all. It is delay. And you must ask yourself a higher question in that moment. Not, what do they want from me? But what is this doing to my clarity? Because growth does not happen in emotionally ambiguous spaces. Growth demands definition. Growth demands honesty. Growth demands endings that are clean enough for the soul to breathe again. There is a sacred discipline in choosing distance when clarity is absent. Not out of anger, not out of ego, but out of respect for your own emotional ecosystem. Because every time you accept half presence, you teach your heart to normalize inconsistency. And what the heart normalizes, it eventually repeats. The most transformative truth is this. Someone can care about you and still not be safe for your emotional peace. Caring is not the same as capacity. Presence is not the same as responsibility. And access is not the same as alignment. So when the offer of, let's stay friends, arrives after a breakup rooted in avoidance, recognize it for what it often is, a pause button on emotional reality. And you were not created to live paused. You were created to move forward with clarity, even when it feels unfamiliar. Because clarity may hurt in the beginning, but confusion will quietly erode you over time. And life always rewards the ones who choose truth over comfort, even when comfort is disguised as connection. Avoidants often use, let's stay friends, as an emotional escape hatch, not as a genuine invitation to build a new kind of relationship. On the surface, it sounds gentle, respectful, even mature. It softens the ending. It reduces guilt. It creates the illusion that nothing is being completely lost. But beneath that softness, there is often something far more complicated taking place internally. It is not always about connection. It is about containment. Containing their discomfort. Containing the emotional consequences of distance. Containing the reality of separation without fully having to feel it. For many avoidant individuals, emotional intensity is not just uncomfortable. It feels overwhelming. When a breakup happens, they may experience a sudden internal pressure. Guilt for causing pain, anxiety about being seen as the bad one, or discomfort with the emotional weight of finality. Instead of sitting with that emotional density, they look for a softer exit. Let's stay friends becomes that exit. It allows them to step out of the romantic structure while still maintaining a sense of relational continuity. It is a way of saying, I don't want to fully lose you, while also saying, I cannot stay in this depth. But what is often misunderstood is that this offer does not necessarily come from emotional clarity. It comes from emotional regulation. It regulates their discomfort, not necessarily your healing. Because staying friends, in this context, is not always about rebuilding trust or evolving connection. It is about reducing internal tension. If they can still check in, still have access to your presence, still know you are there, then the breakup does not feel like a complete emotional collapse. It becomes diluted, manageable, less final. There is also another layer that operates quietly beneath this dynamic: control without responsibility. Romantic relationships come with emotional responsibility, communication, consistency, accountability, and presence. A friendship label removes some of that pressure while still preserving proximity. It creates a structure where they can engage when it feels comfortable and withdraw when it feels overwhelming. This flexibility may feel safe to them, but for the other person, it often creates confusion. Because the emotional signal is no longer clear. It is neither fully attached nor fully detached. And confusion has a cost. When someone remains in your life after a breakup, but without the clarity of commitment, your nervous system stays partially activated. It keeps interpreting signals, analyzing messages, hoping for meaning in inconsistency. This is why stay friends can feel emotionally heavier than no contact. No contact, although painful, creates truth through distance. Friendship without clarity creates ambiguity while maintaining emotional attachment. Avoidants are often not consciously manipulating in a malicious sense. Rather, they are trying to manage their internal world with the tools they have learned. If closeness triggers pressure and distance triggers loss, then controlled closeness, friendship, feels like the safest middle ground. But safety for them does not automatically translate into emotional health for the other feeler. What feels like balance to one nervous system can feel like instability to another. This is why it is important to understand the difference between intention and impact. The intention behind "let's stay friends" may be comfort, guilt reduction, or emotional softness. But the impact can be prolonged attachment, delayed healing, and emotional confusion. And impact is where truth lives, not in what is said, but in what is repeatedly experienced. At its core, this pattern often reveals an inability to fully metabolize endings. A clean ending requires emotional processing, accepting loss, sitting with discomfort, and allowing separation to become real. But avoidance resists that process. So instead, the ending is stretched into a new form. It is renamed, repackaged, made softer so it feels less final. Yet the emotional reality underneath remains unresolved. And this is where many people get caught. They interpret the softness as care, when in reality it can be discomfort avoidance. They interpret continued access as love, when it may simply be an unwillingness to fully disconnect. But love, in its most grounded form, does not require ambiguity to survive. It does not need emotional fog to remain present. It does not need proximity without clarity to exist. Friendship after a breakup, in this context, often functions less like a genuine relational evolution and more like an emotional buffer zone. It sits in the space between attachment and separation, where nothing is fully resolved, yet nothing is fully released either. For avoidant patterns, this middle space can feel especially appealing because it reduces the emotional shock of loss while avoiding the responsibility that comes with continued romantic engagement. It is not necessarily a conscious strategy with clear intent, but rather a psychological preference for emotional distance that still feels connected enough to be tolerable. When a romantic relationship ends, there is usually a natural psychological process that follows: grief, reflection, emotional recalibration, and gradual detachment. But when "let's stay friends" is introduced too quickly, that process can become interrupted. Instead of allowing the emotional system to fully register the end, the mind is offered a substitute structure. The relationship is no longer romantic, but it is also not fully gone. This creates a kind of emotional limbo where the nervous system does not receive a clear signal to release attachment. The bond is still technically alive, just in a different form, which makes letting go significantly harder. For avoidant individuals, this structure often serves a protective purpose. Full emotional separation can feel like a loss of control over the connection. It can also bring up discomfort around guilt, responsibility, or the intensity of another person's emotional response. By shifting into friendship, they reduce the pressure of those emotional demands. They are no longer expected to show up with consistency, emotional depth, or relational accountability. Yet they are still able to maintain a sense of presence in the other person's life. This creates a controlled environment where intimacy is minimized, but connection is not entirely severed. From the outside, this arrangement may appear mature or compassionate. It can be framed as, "we still care about each other," or "we don't want to lose what we had." But beneath that framing, there is often a subtle imbalance in emotional labor. One person may still be emotionally attached, still interpreting signals, still hoping for reconnection, while the other is engaging in a more selective, lower intensity form of contact. This difference in emotional investment is where confusion begins to grow. Because the label is friendship, but the emotional reality does not match the simplicity of that word. What makes this even more complex is that occasional contact can reactivate emotional attachment. A message, a check-in, or a casual conversation can reopen emotional pathways that were beginning to settle. The brain does not always distinguish between romantic and friendly contact when the emotional history is still active. It responds to familiarity. It responds to patterns. So even minimal interaction can create waves of hope, nostalgia, or longing. This is why friendship after breakup can sometimes feel more destabilizing than distance itself. Avoidants often find comfort in this dynamic because it allows them to regulate emotional intensity on their own terms. They can engage when they feel safe and withdraw when they feel overwhelmed. The structure becomes flexible, non-demanding, and emotionally contained. But that flexibility is not always mutual. For the other person, it can create uncertainty. There is no clear beginning, middle, or end, just ongoing presence without definition. And the human mind naturally seeks definition. Without it, it starts to fill gaps with interpretation, assumption, and hope. This is where emotional imbalance quietly develops. One person is gradually detaching through reduced responsibility and emotional distance, while the other may still be processing loss within an active connection. It creates a situation where healing is delayed, not because of lack of awareness, but because of inconsistent emotional cues. The heart cannot fully close what is still occasionally open. There is also an important psychological truth here. Clarity is a form of emotional kindness. Even when it is painful, clarity allows the nervous system to settle. It gives structure to grief. It defines reality in a way that the mind can eventually accept. But when friendship is used as a substitute for closure, clarity becomes diluted. The ending is no longer a clear line. It becomes a blurred transition that stretches emotional processing over time. In many cases, what is labeled as friendship immediately after a breakup is not a new relationship at all, but an extension of the old one, with reduced intensity and increased ambiguity. It carries echoes of the past while avoiding the responsibilities of the present. And while it may feel softer in the moment, it often makes emotional healing more complex because the heart is still being given just enough connection to remain attached, but not enough consistency to feel secure or move forward. One of the most overlooked reasons avoidants ask to stay friends after a breakup is their deep discomfort with emotional accountability, paired with a strong need to maintain psychological distance from guilt. On the surface, it can look considerate, even responsible. It sounds like they are trying to preserve a bond, soften the impact, or show that they still care in some way. But beneath that surface, there is often a quieter internal movement happening, a desire to remain connected without being fully responsible for the emotional consequences of the disconnection they created. In romantic relationships, emotional responsibility is unavoidable. It requires presence, consistency, repair after conflict, and the willingness to sit with another person's emotional needs even when it feels uncomfortable. For avoidant patterns, this level of emotional engagement can feel overwhelming or destabilizing. When the relationship ends, there is often a residual emotional residue left behind. Guilt for withdrawing, discomfort about hurting the other person, or unease about being perceived as someone who abandoned the connection. These feelings do not disappear just because the romantic label ends, so instead, they are managed through structural redefinition. Friendship becomes that structure. By offering friendship, they create a psychological middle ground where responsibility is significantly reduced. They are no longer required to meet emotional expectations associated with partnership, yet they can still signal care, goodwill, and presence. This reduces internal guilt because it reframes the ending as less absolute. Instead of, "I left you," it becomes, "We are still in each other's lives, just differently." This reframing is powerful because it softens the moral weight of separation. It transforms a definitive ending into an ongoing connection, which is easier for them to tolerate emotionally. There is also a subtle form of self-protection embedded in this dynamic. Guilt, when fully felt, demands emotional processing. It requires reflection, empathy, and sometimes the painful acknowledgement of one's limitations in intimacy or commitment. For avoidant individuals, sitting in that emotional space can feel intense or even destabilizing. So instead of fully entering that process, they externalize resolution through continued access. If the other person is still available, still communicating, still emotionally reachable in some form, then the breakup does not feel like a complete rupture. It feels softened, almost reversible in its emotional texture. This is where the illusion of goodness can also come into play. Staying friends can help preserve a self-image of being kind, respectful, or emotionally mature. It allows them to believe, and sometimes signal to others, that they did not simply discard the relationship. They transitioned it. They did not abandon. They adjusted. This narrative can reduce cognitive dissonance, the internal tension between "I ended something meaningful" and "I am still a good person." Friendship becomes a bridge that connects those two conflicting realities without forcing full emotional confrontation. However, the impact on the other person is often very different. While one side experiences reduced guilt and increased emotional distance, the other may still be emotionally invested, still processing attachment, and still interpreting ongoing contact through the lens of connection. This creates an asymmetry that is not always visible at first. The word friendship suggests equality, but the emotional dynamics underneath may still be shaped by the original attachment structure. One person is recovering from loss while still being intermittently present in the connection, while the other is gradually detaching with less emotional responsibility. This imbalance can lead to subtle confusion. Because the presence remains, the mind struggles to categorize the relationship accurately. It is no longer clearly romantic, but it is also not fully platonic in emotional residue. That ambiguity can keep emotional circuits active longer than necessary. The nervous system continues to respond to signals of familiarity, even when the relational foundation has changed. And in that space, healing becomes less linear. It becomes delayed, fragmented, and dependent on external cues that may not be consistent. Another important layer here is how avoidance of accountability can sometimes masquerade as emotional gentleness. It is easier to say, "Let's stay friends," than to sit in the discomfort of a clean ending. A clean ending requires facing the reality of impact, acknowledging hurt, accepting emotional consequence, and allowing separation to be fully real for both people. But when that is bypassed, the ending remains emotionally incomplete. Friendship becomes a way to avoid the finality of that emotional responsibility, while still maintaining a sense of relational continuity. Ultimately, what appears as a soft and caring gesture may actually be a way to distribute emotional weight more comfortably for the avoidance system. It reduces internal discomfort, preserves self-image, and maintains proximity without obligation. But emotional truth is not measured by intention alone. It is revealed in structure, in consistency, and in impact. And when responsibility is softened for one person, but emotional ambiguity is increased for another, the result is not shared healing. It is uneven processing, disguised as continued connection. Avoidant patterns often struggle not just with relationships, but with emotional processing itself. Feelings do not always move through them in a clean, structured way. Instead, emotions can feel fragmented, delayed, or overwhelming when they finally surface. So after a breakup, instead of fully sitting with what has ended, there is often a tendency to find ways to soften, postpone, or redistribute that emotional experience. This is where "let's stay friends" can become more than just a relational suggestion. It becomes a coping mechanism for unfinished internal processing. When a relationship ends, there is a natural emotional sequence that wants to unfold: shock, resistance, sadness, reflection, and eventual acceptance. But for someone who has difficulty tolerating emotional intensity, that sequence can feel too heavy to experience all at once. So the mind seeks shortcuts. It looks for ways to reduce emotional load without fully engaging in the depth of it. Friendship after breakup becomes one of those shortcuts. It allows the emotional system to believe that the connection has not been entirely lost, which reduces the intensity of grief in the short term. This is important to understand. Unresolved emotions do not disappear just because the external structure changes. If anything, they often remain suspended underneath surface-level interactions. By transitioning into friendship too quickly, the emotional processing that would normally happen in separation gets interrupted. Instead of grief being fully felt and completed, it becomes diffused across ongoing contact. A message here, a check-in there, a familiar exchange that briefly activates emotional familiarity, all of it keeps the emotional system partially engaged without allowing it to complete the cycle of letting go. For avoidance, this partial engagement can feel safer than full emotional immersion. It creates a sense of control over distance. They can step in when they feel emotionally regulated and step back when intensity rises. But emotional processing requires consistency and depth, not intermittent contact. When emotions are constantly interrupted by interaction, they do not settle. They linger. They remain unresolved in the background, shaping behavior without conscious awareness. There is also a psychological pattern at play, where emotional discomfort is externalized rather than internally processed. Instead of fully feeling sadness, loss, or guilt, the mind finds ways to keep those feelings from becoming too concentrated. Maintaining friendship can serve as a kind of emotional dispersal strategy. The pain of separation is reduced by keeping the relationship symbolically alive. If the person is still in your life, even in a reduced form, then the ending does not feel absolute. And if it does not feel absolute, then the emotional system does not fully activate grief in its totality. However, this creates a delay rather than a resolution. The emotions are not processed, they are postponed. And postponed emotions have a way of resurfacing later, often in unexpected ways. They may appear as sudden nostalgia, emotional confusion, or difficulty forming deeper connections in new relationships. What was avoided in one moment does not vanish. It waits. It waits for a safer moment to be felt, or it continues influencing behavior subtly, without being fully understood. Another layer to this is the difficulty avoidants often experience in tolerating emotional finality. A clear ending forces the nervous system to adapt to absence. That adaptation can feel like a loss of control over the relational bond. Friendship, on the other hand, preserves a sense of continuity. It creates the impression that nothing is completely gone, which reduces the emotional shock of separation. But while this may feel stabilizing initially, it can also prevent the emotional system from fully resetting. Without that reset, emotional clarity remains incomplete. The heart does not receive a clear signal that the chapter is closed. Instead, it receives mixed signals: distance paired with access, separation paired with familiarity, absence paired with occasional presence. These mixed signals keep emotional circuits active longer than necessary, making it harder for either person to fully move forward in a grounded way. It is also worth noting that emotional processing is not just about feeling pain. It is about integrating experience. Integration requires stillness, reflection, and absence of ongoing relational stimulation. When friendship continues immediately after a breakup, that stillness is interrupted. The mind remains socially engaged with the source of emotional attachment, which reduces the space needed for internal integration to occur. In this way, "let's stay friends" can unintentionally become a way to avoid the deeper emotional labor of separation. It allows the external relationship to soften, while the internal emotional work remains incomplete. And what remains incomplete in emotion often remains active in behavior, shaping attachment patterns, expectations, and future relational choices in subtle but persistent ways. Avoidant patterns often rely heavily on emotional distance as a way to regulate internal discomfort, and after a breakup, that need for controlled distance does not disappear. It simply changes form. "Let's stay friends" can become a way to preserve a carefully managed balance where closeness and separation exist at the same time, but without the emotional intensity or responsibility that comes with a committed relationship. On the surface, it may appear cooperative or even considerate, but underneath, it often reflects a deeper need to maintain psychological control over how much emotional access the other person still has. In a romantic relationship, emotional dynamics are naturally more immersive. There is expectation, reciprocity, and shared emotional responsibility. When that structure ends, it creates an abrupt shift in relational power and emotional exposure. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that shift can feel destabilizing. Not necessarily because they miss the relationship in its full depth, but because they lose the ability to regulate closeness on their own terms within that structure. Friendship offers a substitute framework where they can still regulate that distance, but now with fewer emotional obligations attached. This is where the idea of control balance becomes important. By transitioning into friendship, they can maintain a sense of influence over the relational connection without being fully embedded in its emotional demands. They are no longer required to consistently show up, emotionally invest at the same level, or navigate the complexities of mutual vulnerability. Yet they are still present enough to remain part of the other person's emotional landscape. This creates a dynamic where connection exists, but it is no longer governed by equal emotional participation. What often goes unnoticed is how this arrangement subtly preserves asymmetry. One person may still be emotionally affected by the bond, still interpreting interactions, still holding emotional attachment, while the other operates from a more detached position. The avoidant individual can choose when to engage and when to withdraw, depending on their internal comfort levels, while the other person may experience emotional continuity in a more linear and unresolved way. This difference in emotional positioning reinforces a quiet imbalance of control over the pole. At the psychological level, maintaining this controlled distance helps reduce feelings of vulnerability. Full emotional closeness requires openness, unpredictability, and exposure to emotional dependency. These elements can feel overwhelming for avoidant individuals, especially after a breakup where emotional intensity has already been experienced. Friendship becomes a way to reintroduce connection, but in a diluted form that feels safer. It allows them to remain connected to familiarity without re-entering emotional depth that feels risky or consuming. However, control over distance is not just about comfort. It is also about predictability. Emotional unpredictability can feel threatening to someone who relies on internal self-regulation rather than relational co-regulation. When relationships become too emotionally charged or uncertain, there is often an impulse to create structure that reduces that unpredictability. Friendship, in this case, acts as a structured form of low-intensity connection. It is defined enough to feel familiar, but undefined enough to avoid pressure. This controlled structure also allows them to manage the emotional narrative of the breakup. By staying in contact, they can maintain a sense of continuity rather than rupture. The relationship does not feel completely erased. Instead, it feels reorganized. This can reduce internal discomfort associated with finality, as well as soften any internal conflict about having ended something meaningful. It gives them the ability to feel as though the connection still exists in some form, even if it no longer functions in the same way. But from the other side of the connection, this controlled distance can create emotional confusion. The presence of ongoing contact may be interpreted as continued significance, even if the emotional depth has shifted. The inconsistency between presence and emotional availability can make it difficult to accurately assess the true state of the connection. This is where emotional misalignment begins to form. One person is regulating distance for stability, while the other may still be navigating attachment within that fluctuating proximity. Over time, this can subtly shape emotional dependency patterns. When access is available but inconsistent, the mind can begin to focus more on availability cues than on emotional reality. This reinforces a cycle where attention is directed toward moments of connection rather than the overall absence of relational stability. In such a cycle, control over distance becomes not just a personal coping strategy, but also a factor that influences the emotional rhythm of the other person. Ultimately, what appears as friendship can sometimes function as a regulated space where emotional closeness is carefully managed to prevent overwhelm. It allows the avoidant individual to maintain a sense of relational presence without re-entering emotional vulnerability or responsibility. But while it may provide stability for one side, it can also create emotional uncertainty for the other, especially when the underlying imbalance in control over connection remains unacknowledged. What is often labeled as care in the aftermath of a breakup does not always reflect the full emotional reality of the situation. In avoidant patterns, care can exist, but it is frequently expressed in a form that prioritizes emotional safety over emotional depth. This means the expression of concern, kindness, or continued friendliness may be real in feeling, but limited in capacity. It becomes comfort without commitment, presence without consistency, and softness without full relational responsibility. At the core of this distinction is the difference between emotional intention and emotional availability. Intention may still carry warmth. There may still be genuine goodwill, a desire not to cause unnecessary pain, or an appreciation for the shared history. However, emotional availability refers to the ability to stay present with complexity, sustain emotional engagement through discomfort, and remain consistently attuned to another person's emotional world. In avoidant dynamics, intention can remain intact while availability becomes restricted. This is why care can sometimes take the form of minimal or controlled contact. A message here and there, a polite check-in, or a softened breakup conversation may feel like emotional kindness, and in many ways it is softer than abrupt disappearance or cold detachment. But softness is not the same as depth. Comfort is not the same as commitment. The presence of gentle behavior does not automatically indicate the presence of emotional readiness for shared relational responsibility. After a breakup, this distinction becomes especially important because emotional vulnerability is already heightened on the other side. When one person is still emotionally attached, even small gestures of attention can carry amplified meaning. A simple message can feel like connection. A casual interaction can feel like possibility. But in avoidant dynamics, those gestures are often calibrated to remain within a zone that feels safe for the person initiating them. They are designed to maintain emotional distance while avoiding the discomfort of complete disconnection. This is where misunderstanding often forms. The receiving side may interpret continued friendliness as evidence of lingering emotional depth or unresolved attachment in the romantic sense. But what may actually be present is a form of regulated connection, one that preserves familiarity while intentionally or instinctively avoiding the intensity of romantic engagement. The emotional structure has changed, even if the surface behavior still resembles connection. There is also a protective element embedded in this form of care. Avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional overwhelm when faced with intense relational dynamics. Maintaining a lighter version of connection allows them to avoid that overwhelm, while still feeling aligned with their self-image as someone who does not completely abandon meaningful bonds. It helps them reconcile internal tension, the desire not to hurt others, and the need to maintain emotional distance for self-regulation. However, this creates a subtle but important imbalance. The form of care being offered is often calibrated to the giver's emotional threshold rather than the receiver's emotional needs. What feels manageable and kind enough, from one perspective, may feel ambiguous or emotionally activating from another. This mismatch is not always intentional, but it can still shape the emotional experience of both individuals in very different ways. Over time, this dynamic can lead to a quiet distortion of what care is understood to mean. If care is repeatedly experienced in a limited or inconsistent form, it can begin to feel normal, even when it lacks the depth required for emotional security. The nervous system may start to associate intermittent attention with connection, even when that attention does not include stability, clarity, or mutual emotional presence. This is where emotional conditioning can occur without conscious awareness. It is also important to recognize that care without capacity often reflects limitation rather than deception. The issue is not necessarily that the care is false, but that it is constrained. The emotional system behind it may not be equipped to sustain the level of openness, consistency, or vulnerability that deeper relational connection requires. So instead of expanding into full relational presence, it expresses itself in smaller, more controlled ways that feel safer internally. But impact still matters. Even if the care is genuine, its form can still create emotional ambiguity. When someone receives intermittent warmth without clear relational definition, it can prolong attachment and delay emotional closure. The heart responds to signals of connection, not just intent behind them. So even limited expressions of care can keep emotional pathways active, especially when they are layered onto an existing bond. In this way, care without commitment becomes a complex emotional space. It is neither absence nor full presence. It is a moderated form of connection, shaped by emotional boundaries that protect one person's internal stability, while potentially extending emotional uncertainty for the other. And while it may feel like kindness in the moment, its long-term effect often depends on whether clarity accompanies it. Without clarity, even genuine care can become emotionally confusing, because the heart does not only respond to how gently something is given, it responds to whether it is clear, consistent, and emotionally complete. Thank you for being here and giving your time and attention to this message. Every moment you spend reflecting on emotional truth is not wasted. It is part of your growth, your awareness, and your return to clarity. If something in these words helped you see things a little more clearly, let that clarity stay with you longer than the confusion ever did. Not everything meant to be understood is meant to be held on to. As you move forward, take what strengthens your peace and release what keeps you emotionally stuck in uncertainty. You do not need to over-explain your healing, and you do not need to stay where your inner voice feels quiet. Goodbye for now, and may what comes next in your life feel lighter, clearer, and more aligned with who you are becoming.